Okay, I'm going to get started with some announcements, and then we are going to transition to our fantastic panel. So welcome to TikTok, DeepSeek, and the Fear of Chinese Tech in Nationalist Times, an event sponsored by the Disco Network, which we planned some months ago, which feels maybe even more relevant than when we first started thinking about doing this. I want to start with a land acknowledgement. This event is taking place on the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Anishinaabe, the Council of the Three Fires, the Odawa, Ojibwa, and Potawatomi, as well as the Wyandot. And as we live here and learn here, we honor the indigenous people who continue to steward this land and those who are forcibly removed from it. The Disco Network is committed to accessibility and digital equity. As such, we invite audience members to experience this event in whatever ways brings you the most comfort. Cart captioning is available and may be accessed via the show captions option if you're on Zoom. The Disco Network is housed in the Digital Studies Institute at the University of Michigan, which is a center for research and dialogue where faculty, students, and visitors focus their inquiry on technology, digital culture, and social justice. Questions concerning the impacts of technology on race, disability, gender, sexuality, class, power, and identity are foregrounded in courses for our undergrad minor and graduate concentration. If you're interested, there's material over there. The undergrad minor is surprisingly easy to get and very fun. And in our annual Summer Institute and in a diverse range of public programs. The Disco Network is a national network of researchers, artists, technologists, policymakers, and practitioners that envision a new anti-racist and anti-ableist digital future. Housed within the DSI, we work collectively to provide mentoring and networking opportunities for BIPOC and disabled scholars, develop interdisciplinary undergrad courses about the intersection of identity and technology, publish open access research on topics of digital social inequity, and host public programming to build the field of race, gender, disability, and technology studies. And DISCO stands for Digital Inquiry, Speculation, Collaboration, and Optimism. It's a mystery. Okay, so here's our co-sponsors. And here are some upcoming events. Tomorrow we have Elisa Jardina Papa, a professor of media studies at Brown, who is going to present on her work as a data worker. Her talk is called Data Heresy, A Queer and Computable Tale, and it's actually going to be here at 3 o'clock. We also have a conference, What is Critical Now? Media Studies Between Crisis and Critique, which is got some incredible speakers, Hannah Zevan, Ranjaj Dhaliwal, Thomas Pringle, and others at Hatcher Grad Library. And we also have a new exhibit at the Shapiro Library, 8-Bit Music. So there are a number of activities related to that. I think if you're a retro gamer, you really need to go to this. It'll be very fun. Okay. We also have another event in this series through DISCO called Building the Indigenous Internet. That's going to be April 14th. So we have two visitors, Ashley Cordes, University of Oregon, who's just written a book on indigenous cryptocurrency, and Marley Lister, who is a geographer from University of Arizona. So I'd like to introduce our panelists. I'm so excited that we're having this conversation. Tara Fickle is an associate professor of Asian American Studies at Northwestern. Her first book, The Race Card from Gaming Technologies to Model Minorities from NYU, won the Before Columbus Foundation's American Book Award. And it explores how games have been used to establish and combat Asian and Asian American racial stereotypes. Fickle's current research projects include the racialized dimensions of esports, virtual currency harvesting in video games, and a digital archive of the canonical Asian American anthology, IE. She teaches courses on Asian American culture, gaming, comics, and the digital humanities. We also have our own Ian Shin, who is an assistant professor in the Department of History and American Culture. He's a historian of the 19th and 20th century United States and is interested in how culture, broadly defined, reflects but also shapes the politics of its time. His research and teaching concentrate on U.S.-China relations, U.S. empire, immigration, and the Asian American experience. His book manuscript, entitled Imperial Stewards, Chinese Art and the Cultural Origins of America's Pacific Century, examines Chinese art collecting in the US in the early 20th century as a contested process of knowledge production that bolstered ideas of American exceptionalism, even while it relied on trans-Pacific circuits of labor and expertise. Our next panelist is Jeff Yang, who has been observing, exploring, and writing about the Asian American community for over 30 years. He launched one of the first Asian American national magazines, A Magazine, in the late 90s and early 2000s, and now writes frequently for CNN, the New York Times, and elsewhere. He has authored 3 books: Jackie Chan's new New York Times bestselling memoir, I'm Jackie Chan, My Life in Action, Once Upon a Time in China, a history of the cinemas of Hong Kong, Taiwan, and the mainland, and Eastern Standard Time, a guide to Asian influence on American culture, and most recently co-authored the New York Times bestselling Rise, A Pop History of Asian America from the 90s to now. And I'm the moderator. My name is Lisa. I teach in the Department of American Culture, and I have been writing about digital bodies, race, and gender in games and online environments since 1994. So really long time before the internet was very popular. And I've written some books about that. So that's enough of that. Okay, so I just want to kick us off by saying part of what the Disco Network wants to do is to bring people together who might not normally encounter each other. So people from different disciplines, but also people who are living in the world as activists and as writers and as community members and doing other kinds of really, really key work. Because I think, as has been proven very true lately, sometimes higher ed is viewed as a closed circuit where other people are not welcome or wanted, and that is absolutely something that needs to be addressed. So I'm going to start off by saying, or asking the panelists if they could say a little bit about how their own expertise and research informs their approach to anti-Chinese sentiment in regards to tech in 2025. So, feel free.
Sure. I guess I'm physically most at the front of the line, as it were. So, I mean, I've been writing about entertainment and technology, especially across the divide of Asia and America, or Asia and the West, since, oh my gosh, 1991, 1990. And in the course of that time, we actually have seen this tremendous ground shift, not just in some ways, the kind of cultural readiness for the West to really acknowledge the profound influence that Asian popular culture and technology and frankly, cultural influence in the broadest sense impact us living here in the United States. But also, we really have seen, how do I put it, like a sort of passing of the torch in a lot of ways in the nations themselves that have served as the primary sources for that influence. In the 80s and maybe even the early 90s, we saw Japan as kind of the epicenter of, in some ways, sort of scary influence in America. It was a time of, Japanophobia. It was a time when Japan Inc. was this looming force that was poised to take over industry, pervade us with technology that would destroy our competitiveness and possibly be spying on us. It was a time when the car industry was being challenged and protectionism was running rampant. Frankly, it feels very familiar to today. Kind of turn the clock forward, you go through a period when cultural influence was coming out of parts of Greater China, Hong Kong, for instance, and the export of Hong Kong cinema was a profound part of my growing up, right? But also by the 1990s, a part of everybody's media diet to a certain extent. Korea, all of a sudden, especially post-pandemic, became kind of the epicenter of this new wave of transformative influence on America and on the globe. And China, right, in all of its forms, has continued to sort of cycle back in as both a bogeyman, as kind of an existential rival, but also as this aspirational, kind of exotic, framing device for what a future that wasn't centered in America might look like. So that's where I come to in exploring this idea of how anti-Chinese sentiment manifests in technology, it feels very much familiar, right? We've seen that same kind of anti-Asian sentiment cyclically across other markets, other sources. And it's always this combination of aspiration and appeal, exotic fascination and fantasy, combined with this counterpoint of, but maybe they're too good, maybe they're too powerful, maybe they're too strong. So yeah, I guess that's how I'd at length answer your question.
All right, can everyone hear me? No, panel's over. Jeff already answered everything. I'm Tara. Again, thank you all so much for coming. I'm really, really thrilled to be here with the panelists, with Lisa, and really with all of you here in person and tuning in virtually. So my interest, where I'm coming to the question of anti-Chinese sentiment in tech, actually comes from far, far earlier to the late 19th century, which is perhaps a lot earlier than many of us may think of technology in relationship to race. But my research, maybe over a decade ago now, really started by thinking about how we could combine media and digital studies with Asian American studies, with ethnic studies, and to take a look back at early immigration, specifically early Chinese immigration to the States, and recognizing how much of the rhetoric there that was aimed at excluding immigration largely was couched in the language of gaming. And at that time, gaming was explicitly gambling, right? So there was all sorts of language of vice and immorality that were then combined with the logic of so-called cheap Chinese labor. In other words, casting Chinese and then later Asian immigrant groups as those against whom there could be no fair competition in a various number of ways, starting with industries like mining, logging, railroads. And so I really see some of these patterns having extended across a long number of years. And so where we are now, actually, we see a lot of those same patterns in which Chinese producers, Chinese in the video game industry, because my work has increasingly shifted to focus on video games, are increasingly characterized in similar ways as kind of cheap in their play, whether we're talking about kind of robotic or automated play, if we're thinking about competitive video games, or as cheaters, copiers, counterfeiters, and most recently kind of co-opters of American intellectual property through things like corporate acquisitions of large American technology companies by Chinese companies like Tencent. So for me, that really intersects with what Jeff is talking about in terms of what we sometimes will call Orientalism or techno-Orientalism, coming from Edward Said's concept, and then later in the 80s, to talk about how the racialization of Asian Americans is really inextricable from how they're being seen as technology.
So we seem to be moving back in time because I'll take us back even further to the 18th century. Thanks for being here this afternoon. It's really wonderful to see this turnout. I hope you're all enjoying the boba. My name is Ian Shin. As Lisa said, I teach in history and American culture. And so perhaps not surprisingly, I'll take us back even farther than where Tara has landed, because part of how I think about the landscape of competition between different Asian countries in the United States today is, I don't want to be too schematic about it, but if you think about this moment, it's really the first time in history where we've seen an Asian country and the United States essentially at the height of their powers contesting with each other. And when we're thinking about sort of the trajectories of different Asian countries, right, these countries have had long relationships with each other for 2.5 centuries. But if you're thinking about, for example, early US-China relations in the late 1700s, right, in that particular time period, China was in some ways on the rise, and the United States was really an emerging kind of country, a new sort of decolonial nation coming out of the shadows of Great Britain, right? And so that power dynamic in some ways was sort of inverted, where the United States in many ways looked to China as a source for the kind of really beautiful manufactured goods that Americans couldn't make themselves, things like porcelain. Over time, that trajectory has changed, right? Over time, over the last sort of 200 years, beginning in the mid-19th century, China's sort of influence started to wane under the power of Western imperialism. The United States started to industrialize and become a more sort of modern country. And so they kind of cross paths in terms of their trajectories, right? China kind of was declining in terms of its influence, and the United States was rising. And then you kind of have this moment where, in the sort of mid-1900s, in the mid-20th century, China comes out of World War II with the Chinese Revolution. The Chinese Communist Party takes over. The United States is sort of at the height of its power in some ways during the early Cold War. And now China sort of made its way back, right? So if you think about the kind of evolving trajectory, right, almost like I'm not a scientist, but some kind of wave that we're seeing in for the first time, the kind of point where both countries are in some ways kind of at the peak of their powers and contending as to who is going to take this kind of landscape forward. You can apply that in some ways to Japan. In some ways, even before the Japanophobia of the 1980s, there was a moment in the early 1900s when Japan was really vying to be the sort of first great Asian power. In 1904, 1905, it wins a war against Russia, and that's a moment when the West starts freaking out that an Asian empire might actually defeat the West. And what's interesting is, again, if you think about the trajectory at that particular point, the United States was just emerging as sort of an imperial power in the early 1900s. And so it had still that kind of veneration and respect for Japan that by the 1980s, right, where the United States is kind of much more powerful, treats it with much less respect and much more disdain, right? And so I think it's important to sort of think about, again, these sort of curving waves of national power. The other thing I'll say as a historian, and especially as an Asian Americanist, is to think about the human impact of this. And we'll get into more of this, I think, over the course of the conversation. All of us who are here, in Ann Arbor today, may be familiar with the history of Vincent Chin. And it would be terrible to start this program without acknowledging that this kind of anti-Asian sentiment has very real consequences. Vincent Chin in 1982 was beaten to death by two white men who were really kind of under the influence of this Japanophobia at a time when the Japanese auto industry was thought of as overtaking and undermining the U.S. auto industry. Vincent Chin was a week from getting married, was at his bachelor party at a bar in Highland Park, just outside of Detroit, and two men allegedly said to him, according to one witness, "It's because of you," expletive that I won't say, that we're out of a job. And so, these are not kind of incidental occurrences. In the last 5 years, those of you who've tracked the rise and surge of anti-Asian violence and discrimination have seen the recycling of this kind of rhetoric. And I think that's also part of the picture, besides the kind of macro waves that have intersected at various points, to think about the way that it really affects people in a really personal and oftentimes tragic kind of way.
That's a great transition to our next question. You are all too young probably to remember what it felt like to be an Asian American during that period of Vincent Chin. So right now, 81% of Americans view China unfavorably, which is the lowest it has been since polling has started, at least with Pew. So this question of what it feels like to be an Asian American right now, I think is part of what this is about. What factors do you think are related to this low opinion of Asians? And what implications do you see for Asians and especially Chinese Americans living in the U.S. right now?
I think that when you're thinking about things like polling numbers, they're fairly fungible. They're volatile, right? And they're driven more than anything else by framing from the highest level, by political rhetoric, by media framing, even by the sort of casual ways in which we use certain kinds of language synonymously. We speak of China and Chinese as if they're the same thing. We speak of China and Chinese, and to a certain extent, Chinese Americans in similar breaths. And more than anything else, I think that when you look at the way that these cycles of discourse have operated, when you're talking about Asian countries in general, as much as anything else, I see it in some ways as a reminder of the perils of assimilation. And what I mean by that is, whether you're talking about countries abroad or people of color here in America, the original rhetoric that white establishment forces tend to use is we will be happy with you. We will embrace you if you try to be like us. Learn what we know, right? Try to be closer to us in various ways. Learn our sciences, learn our technology, learn how to actually be productive partners in this great game of global economics and social enterprise. And when you actually get to this point where you are approximating a peer of ours, we'll welcome you as a junior partner into this enterprise. The problem, of course, is the closer you get to actually approximating that standard, the more frightening you become, right? And in our conversation prior to this panel, there is this I mentioned, this very strong sort of phase-based process where at first there's fear of labor, right, of Asian bodies. Oh, there's so many more of them than us. They can make things cheaper, to your point about cheapness. They can flood our country with their bodies, take our jobs. They can create factories we can't compete with because we treat human beings like human beings. Life is cheap over there, right? Moving towards fear of capital. Once these countries and these people become more prosperous, they're going to come and buy our stuff. They don't have to compete with us anymore. They'll just own our things, right? And then finally, fear of ideas. Oh my gosh, they've won on labor. They've moved on to winning on capital. Now they're winning on innovation. They're going to out-innovate us. This is a terrifying view of a future in which Asians are centered and we are not, or something. That has happened time and again. It's happened with Chinese, and then Koreans, and then Japanese, and then Koreans, and then China again. And it's happening very profoundly right now. We are really at a place where the sharp fear that we're seeing against the technological rise of China is this signaling in the West, and especially in the United States, that there is fear of a Chinese future, right? Not just a Chinese present.
Yeah, I'll chime in here. This is Tara for the captions. I think where you started, Jeff, exactly right, is to point to the kind of dehumanizing, homogenizing language. When we say China, we often talk about the Chinese, right, as if they are all one. And to some extent, that ends up filtering directly into the way that Asian Americans are viewed or Chinese Americans are viewed as a homogenous mass. It also makes me think of, I love the spatial metaphor of the kind of oscillating waves that you talked about, because I agree that however the kind of polling is framed, there is certainly a kind of undercurrent of xenophobia that's been here for many, many decades. I don't think that whether polling or informally, Americans have ever had a kind of higher than 50% positive attitude towards China. But I think it's specifically, the way that you framed it was kind of the tops of two waves. And I think the way that China has been talked about now for, probably like the last 15 years is a rising China, right? I've never heard of a risen China. Like, China has already risen, but I think it has, right? And so the reason we continue to talk about the rise of China as this constantly deferred event that hasn't happened yet is because it hits this really deep fear, but this means the end of U.S. empire, that the sun is setting. And, I don't want to downplay that that's very scary for people who have enjoyed that experience for, as you said, the better part of 200 years now. What does that look like? What does that mean? And so it really explains even more why we tend to fall back, I think, on those narratives of authoritarianism, bogeyman, anything that we can project onto this mirror that is not us.
I mean, if there's this is Ian, if there is a point at which U.S.-China relations was kind of at its friendliest, right? You would probably be looking at the early 1900s when, according to at least one historian, the United States saw itself as having a special, quote-unquote, special relationship with China. And by special, they mean really, we've taken you under our wing, you're our little brother. The idea back then, in those early decades of the 20th century, is that China was essentially United States in the making, right? That it was a very large country that spanned almost an entire continent. It had hundreds of millions of people, right? So there was this sort of imagination in the United States in the early 20th century that China would grow up to become the United States with the same kind of Jeffersonian sort of yeoman farmer ideals, these sort of, good, salt of the earth people, and 1949, right, the sort of Chinese Civil War and the rise of the Chinese Communist Party put all of those ideas to bed. And I think partly this sort of number that you see is the fear that it's not just in terms of how they're challenging us, but also that they don't want to be like us. That because for so long, high opinions or friendly opinions towards China was that they will eventually become like us if they just knew what was good for them, if they just follow our example. And you're seeing, I think, in some ways, the realization that the United States is really not all that.
I will add, and I think this is one of the most interesting things about your research too, that as much as there was this sense of China as the little brother, right, that we could shepherd into liberal democracy and capitalism and, take advantage of their work ethic, take advantage of their numbers to create, again, this sort of junior partner abroad. All of this falls down when Chinese people actually start coming to America, right? And for a good, for 60 years, Chinese were excluded from here, even as the products that they were exporting were embraced. I mean, you write about the imperial steward idea of collectors, chinoiserie, Chinese art, etc. All the artifacts of China were celebrated and precious, but Chinese people were not, because it's too close. It's just too close. And that, I think, is a continuing thing we see, that notion of friendship at a distance is much easier, I think, for the American project than it has been when you're talking about the realization of multicultural or pluralistic ideas here in America.
Which I think, sorry, really quick. It really helps explain why things like DeepSeek and TikTok are really interpreted as a threat, right? Not a tool, not just a piece of software, but really very much as a kind of pathogen, as a kind of person that is...
Pathogen.
Yeah, right? Like, not coincidentally, that really invokes that kind of terror.
That's just what I was going to say to lead to the next question. I mean, TikTok and DeepSeek are close. When you said it's a little too close, I mean, TikTok is a huge part of many people's everyday lives. Oh, I mean, that's not even a question. We all know that. And so the notion that it's Chinese, I think, really brings something new to bear on what is at stake in this idea of either big brother, patronage, partnership. I mean, these are all kind of up in the air. So I think this next question, what? What happened? It's a very long question. All right. So I'm not going to read, well, I'll read most of it for the people who are just listening. This is not the first time, as everybody was saying, that Asian media technologies and forms of labor like robotics, so, the Toyota factories that had robot arms were very threatening in the 80s, have been adopted here. The Guardian's writer Andrew Liu says that Trump's strong restrictions on Chinese trade, which was the first thing he mentioned during his 2015 speech when he was announcing his candidacy for president, and his antagonism to Japanese competition in the 80s as a real estate developer, and to more general xenophobia in relation to China and Mexico. So the term enemy alien has come back into the discourse after not having been there for a while. Those of you who are old enough to remember, which might be not many people, in what ways does this moment seem similar to or different from anti-Japanese tech sentiment? So we talked a little bit about the similarities, but how are DeepSeek, TikTok, Foxconn, all of these forums of Chinese innovation and tech power really different from what came before? So is the fear of Chinese AI, which in itself sounds a little racist when people talk about it, but I've heard it talked about quite a bit. How is it different from or similar to these earlier moments?
I mean, I'll start. This is Ian. I think it's impossible to ignore, the sort of difference in political ideology that coming out of World War II, after the United States defeated Japan and played a strong role in shaping its constitution and national culture in many ways, that the United States never felt threatened by Japan in an ideological sense. And so even at the peak of, I think, that economic competition in the 1980s, we were just trying to out-capitalist one another, right? Which is not, I think, the discourse that underlies the competition with China today. And I would also add probably that, and this is, I'm just sort of free associating here, but it also strikes me that as an island change versus like a large, massive, land-based country with the largest military in the world, that China also poses a different kind of threat, kind of it looming in the background militarily speaking than Japan did, which again, for those of you who are familiar with the history of the end of World War II, that essentially the United States constitutionally made it impossible for for Japan to have an offensive military force. That's now being revisited, in fact, right this very moment, as Pete Hegseth goes to visit Japan and has suggested that Japan might play a more active and offensive role in the defense of East Asia. But that was our job, that was our responsibility, and something that we created, right? And I think that matters hugely in terms of not just what is specifically the prospect of economic competition, but that it might be backed up with armed force.
Yeah. There are, I think, kind of two different perspectives on this. One is to say, in Asian American studies, there's this anthology that was really influential called Techno-Orientalism. The new edition, I think, is supposed to come out soon. It's by David Rowe, Greta Yu, and Betsy Huang. And if you haven't seen the introduction, I'd really encourage you to read it, because I think it really nicely lays out how certain racial hierarchies have been kind of mapped onto, generally speaking, Japan, China, and Korea. I'm sorry, yes, but in this particular, Japan, China, and India, in terms of their relationship to technology. And what had kind of settled into the cultural discourse sort of post-1980s is Japan innovates technology. China manufactures technology, and India is is the term they use? Fluent in technology. In other words, right, are kind of the service agents. And so the racialization of those different roles is one that had kind of, Americans had sort of settled into. DeepSeek is different. DeepSeek is innovation, right? And I think that really created a sense of cognitive dissonance, right? So from that perspective, the idea is that DeepSeek is different in part because it's something that is not just about manufacturing, it's about innovation. And even if it's just meeting rather than exceeding closed AI American models, that's still impressive because they did so under constraint, right? Because they had less chips to work with, less resources, et cetera. And then that other piece by Andrew Liu, which is also a really great piece in The Guardian, is that he's actually, I think, pointing out how in some ways we're even closer, though, back to the 1980s, precisely because Trump views China the way that he viewed Japan. And so because he kind of came of age in this anti-Japanese tech moment and thought of tariffs as the solution to that, then the idea that Chinese technology should be viewed the same way means that we're actually now, I think, being kind of retconning Chinese technology to fit that. So I think it's two really interesting ways of looking at that same issue.
Lots of food for thought there. I'm going to say that since you've both spoken about the contrasts, that there actually is sneaky similarity in a lot of ways, because we think of Japan now as being this higher order power, innovators, people who are creating technologies, not simply quote unquote copying them. But when Japan first started to rise as an industrial power, it really had some of the same characteristics. It was cheap labor. It was quote unquote copying at a lower margin, right, at a cheaper cost. Things that were seen as American-made industries, right? Whether it's televisions, radios, and the like. And it actually took a while for Japan to end run that ideal to become this sort of aspirational vehicle for, sometimes kooky ideas, frankly, right? And that kookiness, I shouldn't say kookiness. I feel like it's sort of, ableist and wrong, but there's a sense in which the idiosyncrasy, right, of Japanese aesthetics and in some ways the software attached to the hardware is part of what made Japan a little bit easier to engage with as it migrated from being more of a shop floor power to a a boardroom power, and then ultimately also a lab power, if you will, right? There is a sense in which Japan's relationship with technology itself has always had been interesting. Japan has embraced the idea of animist objects as a part of its culture, lasting long before robots existed. I mean, I've written about this in the past, but there's a reason why when you just do surveys of Japanese elders, a lot of them would prefer to actually be taken care of by humanoid robots than by non-Japanese human beings, right? Which is its own thing. But the relationship with technology has always been one in which the aesthetics and the ideals around humanity has been around concepts of objects as being treasured, as being kind of a part of life and lifestyle, as having almost a spiritual valence that I think when you look at the way that China's industrial rise occurred, didn't exist. China was very much pushed into this space where it was the output plant for other people's innovation, where it was throwing bodies at the problem, and as such, when they had innovation, it was seen as stolen innovation. So the discrepancies there maybe are slightly about the root culture from which these spaces are coming. And even though from the outside there is this, kind of beige blur around East Asia, the fact is Japan and China's cultural identities, their folk religions, there are a lot of things that kind of contribute to the ways in which their technology ultimately expresses itself differently.
I wonder if maybe there's a thread here that's about gender, and in sort of thinking about the aesthetics of Japanese innovation, and sort of some of you are maybe familiar with the concept of kawaii cute, that's how people kind of associate Japanese technological innovation versus, I think the language you're using, Jeff, was much more about kind of like imagining somebody like muscling into a fight in a way that's sort of unfair, right? It's sort of much more kind of a masculinist kind of vibe. I'm curious if you all sort of see kind of a gender interpretation or gendered read of this sort of anti-Chinese sentiment versus what was happening in the 1980s.
It is interesting. I do think that when you look at archetypes and stereotypes, especially as expressions of warfare first and then later economic competition, I mean, they're very similar, but I do think that sneakiness, right, is something that is applied to Japan. China, there's a more brutish, aspect to it. The idea of the coolie, right, the hardworking, quiet, individual who sort of muscles down and sweats it out, has been the primary projection onto Chinese labor, and I think that translates into Chinese technology as well. This idea that China has always kind of brute forced its way into markets. It's always found ways to throw, again, human beings at the problem. We can build objects that can be seen from space, right? Because China is able to do that. Japan is an island. Japan has fewer resources. Japan also, again, culturally speaking, I mean, it's a culture in which the way that it interacts with things almost encourages a preciousness, maybe even a fetishization of those things that translates into the way that they present technology as well. And I do think it's easier for Westerners to embrace, whether through a gendered space or gendered lens rather, or otherwise, this idea of preciousness, of cuteness, of accessibility because it is somehow softer and rounder and super deformed,
Well, it seems worth remembering that, the question of sort of how did we go from this fear and rage and disgust with Japanese products in the 80s to a kind of love and sort of cathecting to them now. And it seems that the kind of Cool Japan campaign that was a very intentional choice of the Japanese governments has been highly effective in terms of kind of promoting Mario and Pikachu and Totoro and all of these characters as basically, national ambassadors. Your question I really liked also in the sense that whether or not we're thinking about the kind of unthreateningness through a gendered lens, there is something I think that is still seen as very uncool about Chinese stuff that is kind of where it's hitting up against that ceiling. And I'm even thinking about the logo of DeepSeek versus the logo of something like ChatGPT, or OpenAI. So the ChatGPT logo is sort of, a symbolic, I don't really know what you would call it, right? But it's sort of black and white line drawing. And DeepSeek, have any of you seen it? It's a little blue whale, right? And it has a smile and like a little blowhole, And it makes sense totally for what it's doing. It's a DeepSeek, AI. But there's something that's just sort of feels awkward. And I feel like people often make this critique about the names of Chinese brands. Like the big Chinese electric car company is called BYD, which stands for Build Your Dreams. And that just sort of sounds a little bit, or the other one I often think of is Hugging Face, right? Which is in terms of engineering. So I do think there's a way in which there's not this kind of smooth, round, cute seamlessness, even though there's very much an imitation of Japanese aesthetics and cuteness to get there.
Yeah, when I first heard of BYD, I thought, is this an underwear brand? Like, I didn't know. But yeah, I think this speaks to one of the issues of why we're even having this conversation. I think China as a factory power, Japan as a soft power, around culture. We're entering into the age of platform power, where China is important there. And so that's not about the content, it's really about the infrastructure, which, as and as you've written about, really creates the conditions of possibility for certain kinds of content to either be there or not to be there. So when TikTok was banned for, 8 hours or even less? In some ways it was less of a big deal than people thought it was going to be. But its coming back was a big deal. I mean, that said something about platform power in this administration even. So we'll go to the next question about platforms like WeChat. And as Jeff was saying, humanoid robots, which seems so kind of in the future a while ago, but maybe not now. So China has been seen as willing to adopt these technologies rapidly in its social, economic, and civic spaces, and sometimes in risky ways. So WeChat is the everything app, AI deepfakes, et cetera. Things like cloning and DNA editing signal a new move in Asia-US relations, as well as the lab leak origin theory for COVID, which kind of went away, but as Jeff has written, is kind of coming back. So how does this compare to Silicon Valley's move fast and break things ideology and its effective accelerationist ideals?
So, I kind of raised this question in our earlier conversation around paralleling not so much China and Japan and Korea, but even just China and the United States, right? And this question of when we see things happening in China that look a little frightening, a little alien, maybe risky and exceptionally dangerous at an existential level, right? People see that as China being not, sort of fearless and innovative, but being terrifyingly kind of unconcerned with consequences, right? And most of these things we're talking about, if you look at some of these, ways in which technology is expressing itself in Chinese cultural spaces, right? China is going all in on certain things. We still have kind of dancing robots as demonstration type things, oh look, they're parkouring now, whatever. But China's actually integrating humanoid robots directly into just very, very present spaces. You go to malls and you'll see, dancing and posing humanoid robots serving as mannequins, right? You see AI. Well, we're at the edges of using AI to do things like output Miyazaki versions of our photographs. China is integrating AI into core aspects of its security, its healthcare systems. I mean, there's this sense in which China is fearsome, not just because it's innovating, but because it seems to be going much faster down that route of integrating technologies into its own society than America's willing to, with consequences for us. Again, that's where the live leak thing comes from. It's like, oh, as China does these things, don't they understand this could harm all of humanity, right? If they create general AI under the specter of communism, we're all doomed to the Matrix or whatever. And I feel like when I see these things being called out, the very things that China is doing at scale are the same things that Silicon Valley is professing as philosophy, is actively trying to evangelize. No, we should move faster. No, we should embrace things rapidly in order to ensure that we can actually learn and grow our way out of our frailties. Why is that? Why is it that it's okay for America's center of innovation to embrace these principles, but when it's a country across the ocean that is, of course, a rival of ours, well, not so okay? Not just in terms of the competition, but in terms of, again, that sort of existential threat to humanity level. That's the question I have.
Yeah, I mean, I think the embodiment of that is open source, right? And the kind of hacker manifesto and the information wants to be free that used to be associated with the early Silicon Valley, right? This true kind of democratic internet fantasy is the closest in AI that we've seen is DeepSeek, is a Chinese AI that comes out of a hedge fund that is now being released nominally open source, in complete contrast to monetized closed models. And I mean, in some ways, I feel like that is, it partly causes a kind of short circuit, right? Wait, how could something be Chinese and cutting edge, and therefore kind of exposes the internal kind of stereotypes and mental models we have? But I also think it goes back in a maybe sort of basic way to Orientalism and Techno-Orientalism defined, I think Toshio Ueno, UENO, defined it as the Orient, it's like a mirror of cultural conceit. So in fact, it's like, China in this case, it's a way of holding up a mirror to the US and saying either this is what we might become or this is what we could have been, right? I mean, you remember when all these anxieties about personal data harvesting, I'm even thinking like a decade ago now, were coming about, or the automation of labor and surveillance. A lot of that was saying, oh no, this stuff is already happening to Chinese people. But what if it's happening to us too? It's like we are the gold farmers, we are the robots, right? And so there's a way in which China has to exist in this kind of tension with the US as a way to displace these things, but also to revive these kind of dreams of what Silicon Valley used to be before it calcified into the kind of corporate logic it is now. And I think it's very unwelcome for many Americans in that space to see it as coming from China. So it's immediately reframed. So Sam Altman and others, right, who were authoring an open AI. It was something like AI for the US Act, right? And kind of making AI an American-led and Western European-led venture. We're saying is that, this is basically Chinese stealing of our technology, right? And training itself on ours. When, of course, as everybody knew, the internal contradiction is that OpenAI was trained on all of your data already, right, for free. But that contradiction seems less on their minds than a way of trying to refit China within this idea that, we're going to make the future of the story of innovation and American technology, because there's no question that AI is going to be part of the future. So the question is, are we going to have people running DeepSeek, or are we going to have them running, Anthropic or ChatGPT or whatever? And that actually becomes one of the only ways for the U.S., I think, to keep its position, right? If we're no longer kind of a military superpower or a global superpower in an economic sense, we at least must be the one, running AI.
I guess the only... this is the question where I feel most like a fish out of water as a historian, because I think, and someone who sort of studies and teaches American culture, that it really exposes these critiques of China and how it's barreling forward, exactly how reluctant we are, and maybe we should just be honest about that the vast majority of Americans, unlike Silicon Valley funders and technologists, are getting dragged kicking and screaming into this future, and they don't like it. maybe we're the only country that's trying to bring back manufacturing, and move the clock back to the late 19th and early 20th centuries, right? And there is this kind of maybe a mistake to sort of take Silicon Valley's discourse as representative of a larger public opinion of what many Americans sort of see in terms of the future of the country. And so maybe then it's not that surprising that they actively react against this sort of like barreling forward, break everything at breakneck pace kind of attitude, because that's not how many Americans think of themselves. Again, I'm speaking broad generalities, and there's a danger to that. But I'm trying to envision, an intellectually honest way of accounting for how, people really do envision a different future for the United States. And I think we saw that in the last election.
Yes, that is so perceptive. I mean, seeing the way that Waymo self-driving cars are being attacked in San Francisco as if they were people, right? They're being beaten and painted, and, people are being dragged kicking and screaming into some mechanized, automated place where they don't envision the national character really being. At the same time, as you're saying, Tara, they want to retain this idea of Silicon Valley supremacy and ingenuity. So the next question has to do with national security, which has been invoked as in a lot of different contexts, from the desire to regulate or even force the sale of TikTok to immigration detention and deportation. And this has developed even as we've talked about this, right, or written these questions. So a broad question is, what does it mean to you to be secure in the context of all we've been talking about for users of platforms or for people who are thinking about automation across trans-Pacific borders? And what other visions of security can we reach for if the ones we have now are not serving us?
I can maybe start on that. I think the premise of the question, right, is that national security or the foreign policy concerns of the United States become the kind of trump card that the U.S. government can play. I just realized what I said. In terms of dictating its various policy initiatives, and that no one can argue against that, right? And so in the last last few moves that the administration has made, especially around immigration detention, right? The sort of deportation of folks to El Salvador, was all done under the guise of national security, and even judges in some ways are told you cannot question this. And some judges have pushed back against this and have said, in fact, you cannot just say foreign policy, or you cannot just say national security and expect us not to ask for specifics and not to challenge that claim. So I think it's important to sort of highlight how it's being used in really manipulative ways to make a case for actions that are either unconstitutional or illegal. The national security framing that I see that the administration making is one that's really premised on scarcity, right? If other people are secure, we're insecure, and I would try to maybe encourage and imagine a vision of security that's a little bit more about abundance, about interdependence, rather than about, this is a zero-sum game, and if we don't, if they have something, then we don't have it. What that looks like, I'm curious if Jeff and Tara have thoughts.
I think, that's a great framing. I think that the ways in which we have articulated geopolitical security has consistently swung back and forth between your point about the zero sum, where it's like only one winner, the sole survivor can exist, and then a world in which we are all safe because we are all part of one another's extended networks. We're all dependent on one another. There's this pendulum that goes back and forth around that, and inevitably it feels to me when we get to the zero-sum swing, the pendulum is smacking Asian people in the face, right? It's like it has inevitably led to like a war with some sort of Asian country, right? When we've seen this in history. And sometimes it is because that country is a rival, sometimes it's because that country is just the first domino, right? That if it falls will lead to some kind of end of the American project, et cetera. But I want to actually home in a little bit more on domestic security, not geopolitical security, because that's what we actually are most in contact with. I mean, we hear a lot about what's happening abroad, but let's be honest. I mean, there was a Richter scale 7 earthquake in Burma. Thousands died. Buildings collapsed. I don't think that most people here in America really experience that as more than just oh, that's a shame, right? Because it's far enough away that we don't feel the ripples of it. But on the other hand, I live in Los Angeles. When it's like a 5.5, everything's shaking just a tiny bit, people go haywire, right? No one has to die. It's like my pool has a ripple in it. Oh my God, There's a sense in which proximity ends up being the real delimiter of what is considered to be secure. Well, if we're talking about domestic security, looking specifically at the reasons for taking people and alienizing them, right, deporting them, making them unpeople, making them outsiders, has gone from, at the beginning of this campaign, this sort of campaign of terror, if you will, to we're removing people who are terrorist sympathizers. We're removing people who are anti-American. To we're removing people who are critical of the government on social media. To now, most recently, Marco Rubio said something which I thought was really wild, even wilder than usual. He said, we have been removing people who are not productive, right? And you see there that the bar continues to lower from people who are a native threat to people who are an annoyance to people who we simply just feel are not giving as much to us as we deserve. And that is a double bind that I think Asian Americans end up being at the very center of, not least because whether we're talking about labor, capital, or ideas, Asian Americans as a smaller group have kind of had a disproportionate impact in each of those. And the epicenter of that right now is scientists, right? You look at Asian American specifically, but not exclusively, Chinese American scientists, and they're in a situation where if you are of Chinese descent, not even a Chinese national on a student visa, but of Chinese descent, here in America, you are facing a world in which if you work in America, then you're always going to have this specter of suspicion that you are not safe, that you are insecure, right? That you might have friends who are in China or family who are in China, and through no fault of your own, maybe they're threatening your family, they'll be able to extract secrets from you and, again, destabilize America in some fashion. The counter, though, is if you don't stay in America, and if you are especially a foreign student here, you go back. It's a brain drain. You're stealing American education and bringing it back to your place of origin. So there's no way in which, in that world, Chinese persons can exist safely. We are inherently a threat of security, right? We are the threat to security. And that, I think, is the single biggest point of danger for us. You brought up the example of Vincent Chin at the very beginning. It begins with Chinese expatriates or Chinese students. It continues to non-native born Chinese Americans or Chinese permanent residents here. And it extends ultimately not just to Chinese Americans, but to Asian Americans at large. There is no differentiation at the end of the day.
And anyone who's mistaken as Asian American. Yeah, I'll first want to second what Jeff is saying, that this is not just sort of a Wenho Lee issue, right? We're not like, oh yeah, that Chinese scientist thing, that was so unfortunate. This happens all the time, right? And a similar situation just happened, at my university last year. So this is really widespread. In terms of the security issue, I'm so glad Ian brought up this question, because I think the question of what sort of security threat AI poses specifically feels radically different than other kinds of digital technology security issues we've encountered. So when many of us now think about digital security issues, we may think about things like credit card fraud or somebody stealing your social security number, phishing scams, over text. And so what I find quite noteworthy is when someone says, well, what is the security threat that something like TikTok poses? And there was even, I think, a technology writer who joked, well, if the CCP wants to know that I like cooking videos and tennis, go be my guest, right? And we've heard this kind of logic before about surveillance, like, well, I don't have anything to hide, so it's not really a problem. And I think that in terms of security or sort of trust, there really does need to be a clearer sense of kind of critical thinking and digital literacy to kind of protect individuals and their ability to not be manipulated by some of this information. Because I think, there's a tendency to ascribe, especially to older generations, a kind of ignorance, like, oh, they're not going to be able to tell the difference between a deep fake, Very few of us would, right, at some point. And so thinking about how one can establish metrics where that could actually be discerned seems really important to me, because I think that the kind of like psyops, disinformation campaigns that actually have worked in the past, right, are very real security threats in that sense, in the sense of actually kind of influencing outcomes, and in a very sort of classical psychological warfare sense, actually changing the way that people are reasoning, right, and their motivation. So to me, it actually seems like AI is right at the forefront of that. And that's yet another reason why we have to it's much easier for us to see that as a Chinese sneakiness issue and displace this sort of AI issue onto it.
Well, I'd like to move to questions because this has been such a rich conversation and everybody's been very attentive and interested. So if you would like to ask a question in person, if you could raise your hand, a staff person will bring the mic to you. And if you are on Zoom, please type your question in the chat and a moderator will read it out for you.
Hello? Okay.
Okay, go ahead.
On the standpoint of TikTok being a security concern, because I do feel like it was somewhat downplayed by a few panelists, but I feel like it is ignored that back in the 2016 election, the Democrats especially, and they were very right for saying this, noted the Russian influence on platforms like Meta as a valid security concern. Like, you have foreign powers that are adversarial powers, not just foreign powers, interfering in domestic affairs. I think if TikTok was owned by Japan or India or Korea, there would not be the same type of dialogue around if TikTok was a national security threat. Whereas China is, at its very purest form, currently an adversary to the United States, because China views themselves as an adversary to us, and we view ourselves as an adversary to them, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. But there is a real, I feel like data is always talked about as the security concern, but as people rightfully point out, Google has your data, Meta has your data. Data is not as much the concern. The concern is that TikTok is a platform where a lot of people are influenced politically, either right or left. You kind of are sucked down echo chamber. And because of how Chinese ownership of even private companies or control over private companies can work, disappearing CEOs, having outsized influence compared to our own influence, like in the United States, the government has limited ability to influence private companies. China doesn't have those same restrictions. They can really influence privately owned companies in China. There is a real concern of influencing political dialogue in the United States from a country that we are adversaries with. And I would ask if it was Russia or like that owned TikTok, I think the conversation would be the same. Like, I don't think it's that it's necessarily an Asian country. It's more the fact that it is a roughly peer adversary or peer adversary to the US. So I'm curious what the panelists kind of think about.
Is there a question that you had?
Yeah, if it was owned by India or Japan or Korea, would we talk about TikTok as being a national security threat? And if it was owned by Russia, would the conversation be any different about it being a domestic security threat?
I mean, there is sort of the context of time, right? Because I think that your question about if Japan owned TikTok, would it be considered to be a threat? Not right now, because Japan isn't seen as ascendant and competitive. But in the 1980s, there absolutely were real concerns about Japan owning things like movie studios, right? Japan investing in things like national monuments, Rockefeller Center. There was a very strong sense in which Japan, the Japan that can say no. Also, there was a very strong nationalist strain in Japan that was absolutely antagonistic towards Western and particularly American cultural influence and political influence over Japan. At that time, I think there would have been similar pushback. But to your point about China and the very real need, I think, to separate out concerns about xenophobia from somehow making it impossible for us to critique China itself. It's a very difficult space to be in because look, I'm Taiwanese American. I have very strong problems with China and the way that it operates geopolitically and even domestically. I've done a lot of work in China, and I've seen manifestly how much government control of information reshapes people's lives. I think, though, that when you talk about something like TikTok as a vector for influencing, say, the American politic, right, the American body politic, you know, I do a lot of research in and around radicalization and the process of online extremism and its evolution. And as much as concerns exist about China being able to exert influence via TikTok, we had some conversation about this in the office hours. You know, it's hard to sort of piece together exactly what kind of propaganda China's trying to do, but there is definitely content out there that feels weirdly pro-Chinese, certainly trying to humanize China. There is the sense in which you see like odd streams of content interjecting into your feed that perhaps is designed to make you feel more comfortable with China. Is that quite the same as the concerns I think that the defense community has around somehow TikTok being used to harvest American data in order to translate that into some kind of, you know, ops data for invasion or something? No, it's not. But yes, there absolutely is, I think, room for worry about any power that has as much control over its social, the social dynamics of its people as China exporting those things, those ideals to America. The problem is I feel like a lot of those ideas already are kind of taking root here. We are already in a space where, you know, if you critique things like the so-called social credit system in China, a way in which all this data is being harvested in order to assign people's status in society, their ability to access certain things based on whether or not they've politically operated according to the government's dicta. I mean, we're kind of moving into that space now. You're in a situation now where you're going to have to show your social media at the border, especially if you're somebody who doesn't look like you belong in America, right? You're in a situation now where your data is already being harvested by commercial actors that don't have your best interests at heart. I would say all of these things need to be assessed in tandem, that it's not solely the geopolitical nexus that is of concern, but rather who has the power over and the control over your online identities, and to what degree do you have the ability to reel that control back in? If the answer is other people and you have very little, then you have a problem regardless of whether it's China or Elon Musk or Mark Zuckerberg or anybody else.
To add something there. Thank you for that question. I was thinking about what Ian said about when an adversary is a strong adversary versus a weak one, and how that really changes the attitudes and the policy and the perception of the people who are from that country who live here, right? And so I was thinking about World War II and how Germany was a strong adversary to the US, but German Americans were not interned in camps, whereas Japanese Americans were. Even white people who were married to Japanese Americans were interned in camps because they chose to go with their partners. So I'm thinking, of, as you say, Jeff, of course, like there are real security risks, but part of what we were considering is the impact on Asian Americans of what's happening. So as critical as we may be of China, personally, there are effects that seem to trickle down for us here by dint of these conversations.
Yeah, I'll say one last thing on that, which is that I think the World War II connection immediately came to mind. But also, you know, we could be having this conversation about, say, fear of Russian technology in nationalist times, right? Absolutely. But we're not, because Russia is not putting out technologies like that, right? And the question is, why not? Right? Like, and part of it has to do with the economy and where innovation is going, right? So on the one hand, I think centering China as the lens is just one of many possible ways that we can talk about it. That also gives us some really interesting historical perspectives on race, region, Orientalism. But the other part to say about that is that Russia and China have absolutely kind of been combined as the two kind of Axis powers in this sense. And communism is obviously, you know, the central tie. But what's interesting is how those kind of old Cold War lines are now being codified in AI policy itself, right? So this kind of AI diffusion framework now establishes tiers of countries that kind of sort of roughly correspond to what we used to think of as kind of developing nation, first, second, third world. And, you know, the first, Japan, South Korea, you know, are all in the kind of most favored nation tier, and they get to have chips, and there's no export controls, right? And then tier 2 is China and Russia, right? And so the limitation on those, I think, is absolutely imagined in similar ways, but I would also say that there is a racial component here. It's just that we haven't had a chance to kind of explore it in quite the same way because I think Russia's status remains kind of marginal to this conversation. Can I take your point?
Any other questions?
Hi. Oh, that's loud. My name's Irina, and I have a bit of like a lighter question. Sorry, is there feedback? Is there feedback? No. Okay, maybe it's just me. And this, I think it's definitely related to what you guys have been discussing, but also I think kind of counter. Something that I've noticed, like being, you know, chronically online and like a member of Gen Z, is like kind of this shift in like, for lack of a better term, like Chinese memes, and not memes like from Chinese people, like memes about China, like from Americans that are like more like complimentary of China and like the culture. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Chinese Heaven TikTok, but like things like that. And it's generally like, it's definitely like a subpopulation. I think anti-Chinese and like East Asian sentiment is still obviously a big concern among like general American populations. But at least this like niche subset, maybe it's just me and my algorithm, but to me it kind of represents like a bit of a shift, at least culturally, and like views of China and Chinese people among like a younger, more online, generally more left-leaning contingent. So I was wondering if any of you guys have noticed this, or if you haven't, like if you have any ideas as to why this sort of cultural shift might be happening.
Can you explain this meme a little more?
I feel like you kind of have to watch it to get the magic of it.
No, it's fine. I just didn't think it would be Chinese, is all.
Christian TikTok creator who like makes these like earnest videos about like faith and Christianity. And one of his videos is like, it uses this like filter on TikTok that it's like, okay. The caption is like, when you get to heaven, but it's Chinese. And the guy like very earnestly is like, oh, that's great. I just didn't expect it to be Chinese. And this kind of like, I feel like this is kind of a catalyst for like this sort of humor, as China is kind of like a mythical place, like in a positive light, especially compared to like, I think traditional sentiment. But yeah, I think I kind of butchered that. Like, I really think you should watch it, but just, yeah.
I think that's hilarious. In part because it actually reminds me, when you talk about technology, one of the sort of, I don't know, epigrammatic, frequent memes, especially in science fiction, is the idea that the only people who can actually go back in time are white people, because everybody else, if they went back past a certain date, would find themselves in circumstances where you would never be able to come back, right? It would just be like terrible for you. And I mean, that meme has actually found its way into actual stories and actual episodes of television and so forth. That we have to remember, the discourse changes over time. The discourse changes over geography, and the imagining of where you might end up if you die. It's like, oh, I've woken up. Oh, I'm in Chinese heaven. is just hilarious to me for that regard alone. I will say this though. I think that musing on the prior question of whether or not TikTok in particular might be a vector for, again, propaganda, you know. I think things like that, even if they are incidental, even if it's like a meme that was embraced in part because whoever the influencer was has just been exposed to a lot of, you know, positive images of Chinese and so forth via the platform, nevertheless do represent in a form of influence. My question is, like, is that necessarily a pervasively negative influence? It is if you are trying to ensure that China stays the enemy. If in other contexts, maybe it isn't. And at the same time, you see sometimes parallel threads of mimetic construction in both China and America that reminds you, even if America is less direct about it, we're still in the same process of kind of engineering content for the engineering of consent, right? So I'm reminded here actually of, you guys know this whole sort of online tradwives content thing, right? You know, people who are grinding corn to make cereal in the morning for their kids and stuff like. There's an entire parallel path of content like that in China, right? And this one influencer in particular who I actually quite enjoy, I think she was like dubbed the wood fairy or something, this Chinese peasant girl who like literally constructs furniture in her spare time and, you know, while also cooking delicious meals for her grandmother. And it's just all shot through this particular filter that makes it clear that she is making China great again. And then, you know, this nostalgic sense of bringing back these traditional values and the hard work and ethics of yore. I look at that content and I look at this sort of tradwife content and I'm like, they're trying to do the same thing. But the difference is her content is probably specifically endorsed and pushed out into channels by the Chinese polity, whereas here it has to go through several cycles of intervening sponsors, if you will, before, you know, you get to the point where tradwives are being elevated. It's not the government's paying these people to do this stuff. It's that billionaires are paying people to pay these people to do that stuff. So is it different? It is different, but I think it should educate us to recognize that we have to be as critical, I think, of both, right? And understand what they're trying to do with them.
Another question here?
Yeah, so I heard you guys talk about the fear over Chinese AI in the United States, and you kind of already touched on this, but like over the quickly integrated AI industry and like the open source strategy. So this led to my question of how do you think that this open source strategy, where the public can access and develop the tech, like with DeepSeek, and I don't know if you guys know this, but also Alibaba developing AI, how do you think this will affect the race against the U.S. for dominance in like the tech world and the first AGI? And since you guys kind of already touched on this, like a follow-up would be, how would the U.S. win this race and compete without like integrating the open source strategy?
I don't have anything brand new to add except to kind of synthesize some different perspectives from more like AI policy and AI researchers that I've looked at. And I think the two perspectives is one has to do with where the value actually lies. So is the value in the AI model, or is the value in like the app that the model is built into, or the infrastructure through which, you know, whatever smartphone, or, you know, like if, you know, you have a 10-cent phone and an app and it also has the AI, right, and then it's kind of distributed through there, is that the way to kind of make value and dominance? So the question is the open source thing actually ruining value, right? And if it's not the model itself that is where the value comes from, then my understanding is that those kind of currently closed US models aren't necessarily sort of threatened by the open sourceness of it. But it does need to, I think, depend on, there was a second part of your question there about how it will kind of affect the race, right? So I think a lot of the kind of excitement about DeepSeek initially was the idea that it was both much cheaper to run and also that it required far fewer resources and that it was free and open source. But it seemed like as time went on, it turned out that some of those numbers were slightly overinflated, not really by the company itself, but by a kind of interpretation of the report that had come out. So it actually wasn't at scale necessarily that much cheaper to run, right? Like it was still cheaper, but not quite kind of the, what was called like the Sputnik moment, right? That it had been advertised as. So my sense is that from people who are working on the kind of like Western European and American side of AI, there's a recognition that there is a need to remain kind of vigilant and continue innovating, but that DeepSeek is something that, from a technical perspective, is still kind of on the trend line for AI innovation. So a lot of it is going to have to be about, sort of which country is on the infrastructure development. And China is certainly thinking about this in terms of rolling out its AI, not just within China, but Southeast Asia, right, Africa, all of these other countries, that it can kind of nearshore all of that happening. So I think the question of whether export controlling chips and having that trying to be the limiting factor may or may not play out. I think that it seemed like people felt that this moment was a big sign to the US that the attempt to close down the model and close down and restrict exporting of AI was actually not the right method, that it had actually been stifling innovation in a way that DeepSeek reminded us we kind of needed to change, maybe thinking about reasoning or other kinds of models.
Okay, is there an online question?
Yes, so we have a question from Zoom, which is, what do the panelists think about the parallels between DeepSeek in the AI industry and Samsung in the mobile devices industry? There has never been much discussion in the United States over the threat of Korean domination in one of the most profitable industries in the world. As it stands today, although only 25% of the US market share belongs to Samsung, Samsung clearly is the top dog around the world. What makes DeepSeek so unique that it requires aggressive legislation and excessive lobbying, aside from the fact that South Korea is considered an American ally?
Wow, that's a great question, actually. I mean, I think part of it is that Samsung does not, in fact, actually control the brains of its mobile devices, right? It is Google that does so, and in fact, there's actually been legislation to try to separate out, Google's Chrome OS and Google's, mobile operating system, business essentially from the mothership. I actually think, though, that there are some interesting parallels. I was just musing them over when I was listening to that question. That kind of stem from a different space. And it really does ask the question of, like, well, who's going to win, right? Well, I'm not sure that the answer of is China going to win or is America going to win makes as much sense as the question of, if we look at this from a business perspective, where are we right now in the state of business evolution? And what I would say is that maybe the better parallel is digital music, right? I think we're kind of in the world right now, for those of you guys who remember this, maybe a lot of them are too young, we're kind of in the Napster world, right? We're in a world where people are flying this sort of pirate flag, just, constantly leveraging the invasion of data privacy, taking other people's work and innovation and building on top of it, whether legitimately through open source or otherwise. There's just a lot of this kind of chaotic investment and activity in and around sort of just, inculcating the demand, really, for this, making people feel like this is something that people want to have. And all this money that's being spent, all this effort that's being spent, I feel is kind of like going to produce no winners in the near term. I don't think any of the companies, I don't think OpenAI, I don't think, Anthropic and Claude, I'm not even sure Google is going to actually come out with the winner's flag when it comes to AI, or that there will even be a winner's flag. I do think that the platforms that will end up emerging out of this, a generation downstream, and generations are much faster these days, right, are going to look very different. And their approach to what AI does and where it comes from is going to look very different. So in some ways, the question of, is it going to be DeepSeek which wins, or is it going to be Claude or ChatGPT or whatever that's going to win, doesn't make as much sense from that perspective. We're in a time when I think 1,000 flowers are blooming, and a lot of them are going to get mowed down. So from a national security perspective, I mean, I find it hard to trust that multinational enterprises that are invested in by, in many cases, the sovereign wealth funds of countries other than our own are necessarily American companies anyway, or in the best interest of the American politic, right, the American people. So I would like to think that the biggest concern we have is one around creating better guardrails for humans at large, as opposed to saying, can America beat China in this one particular technological rivalry?
Yes, I forgot to mention that Jeff writes for the Wall Street Journal.
Well, I did.
Or did? Okay.
I had disagreements with their editorial staff
I
after a
see.
while.
Okay.
But also, I got conflict of interest out of writing for the Wall Street Journal because I was a cultural critic writing about television, and then all of a sudden my son ended up being on television. So it kind of ended
That's a whole other fascinating story. Anybody else want to speak to this question, or we have other questions too? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Hi, to the panelists, thank you for coming out. I really appreciate it. Jeff in particular, I'm a regular listener to They Call Us Bruce. Love it. And I was actually just recently listening to your episode on diversity, equity, and inclusion, in the current moment where U of M has disbanded its DEI programs. I really appreciate the conversation about the extensive historical scapegoating of Asian Americans, and have been wondering about how Asian Americans often, to the popular narrative, fall out of the benefits of DEI, the same conversation with affirmative action, where it's not necessarily helping us. And it's moments like this where I think that DEI is a really powerful counter mechanism to this kind of scapegoating and historical racism, things like that. I was curious if you could speak to that further, and just how we should be creating tools, or what tools we have to fight against these giant national narratives of US versus China, or things like that, in education or things of that sort.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for listening to our podcast. And second of all, great question, because I do think these things are part and parcel. We've been speaking a lot about geopolitics, but for Asian Americans as much or more than many other groups, the international is domestic, right? Foreign policy is domestic policy. And when we talk about something, especially like DEI, one of the things that we get caught up in is this idea that DEI is programs. Right? The DEI somehow is the institution of campaigns or initiatives or specific policy statements that we can all sign on. No. DEI is people. DEI is not programs. DEI is diversity, is us, right? So at the end of the day, we are not going to be saved by the forces of I would say transitional attempts to create equity so much as we are by a broader just prioritization of pluralism in our conversation, in our discourse, and in how we actually live our lives. Now, how are we going to create that? That's a much bigger conversation. I am more terrified than anything else when I look at what's happening domestically, at how fragile and vulnerable these institutions have been. The same ones that we thought were going to defend our democracy, the same ones that we thought were going to protect our security, the same ones that we thought were going to be institutions that we could rely on in a time of vast volatility. They're folding like toilet paper, sprayed with a garden hose. And again, that speaks to me this notion that we cannot rely on these transitory statements of solidarity that are exercised from above. What is the answer to that? I'm not 100% certain, but I do know that the reliance on the assertions that we have seen has made us vulnerable. And we only need to look back a few years to when Black lives actually mattered, and people thought that Me Too was a movement that was going to actually alter the shape of Hollywood and business. It's kind of fucked up. I'm sorry. I've not much else I can say on that note, except the fact that we're even here and having boba and having this conversation is probably more important to me than any sort of statement of solidarity that we've seen in the past that has since become toilet paper. Thank you.
My short reaction to this is capitalism is not going to save us. But a
communism is neither.
Yeah. I think my one way to maybe bring this down to, and I was talking about this with some of the students earlier this morning. Hi, Tyler. Is to think about how this translates into a very discrete material way that might impact, we are sitting here at the University of Michigan, and might impact us here beyond sort of these diversity statements, these larger discourses around fear of foreign control, right, of platforms like TikTok and DeepSeek, right, translate into other areas of life as well. And so some of you may have been following, for example, legislation passed in, for example, Florida and Texas, which have banned the purchases of land near secure and sensitive sites by citizens or foreign nationals of countries of concern, is usually the phrase that is used. And they generally tend to be China, Russia, North Korea, and several other countries in the Middle East. And these are reminiscent of laws that were passed in the early 20th century, long since ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, that targeted land purchases by people of Asian descent, especially Japanese people in the early 1900s, who were known for being especially skilled at agriculture. And it's a rehash of those laws. In Florida, just this past weekend, a Chinese language professor was fired from New College of Florida because he is an asylum seeker from China, and Florida has a law that says that you cannot hire, the public university system of Florida cannot hire or collaborate with someone who is a foreign national from a country of concern. Even though he is seeking asylum because he's been criticizing Xi Jinping, or at least according to him, he's been criticizing Xi Jinping. Those kinds of laws are also being proposed in the state of Michigan, right? In the last 2 weeks, we have seen a package of 9 laws put forward by the Republican-led House of Representatives, both on land acquisition and also on contracting with foreign nationals from quote-unquote countries of concern. And so this is not a sort of force or process that's just happening out there in a macro sort of abstract kind of way. These are debates that are happening right here in the state of Michigan. And I would encourage you to sort of look into those specific pieces of legislation. I believe they're bills like 4232 to like 4240 or something like that. I don't know the exact numbers. But those are debates that are really live right now in terms of the way that people are using this idea of foreign influence or foreign control in order to shape various aspects of our life in the state of Michigan.
One short comment on it. This is just echoing and agreeing with both what my panelists have said, but the sort of larger question about sort of what can we as Asians and Asian Americans do, if anything. And I know it sounds like kind of a simplistic answer, but I do feel like attend events like this one, ask questions at events like this, organize at events like this. You know, when I look out in the audience and I say, why are there so many Asian American faces here? Maybe you've been asked to come for a class, or maybe it was the boba or whatever. But I feel like, why are we all Asian Americans up here? And it's because we see something that other people don't. It's because we think about this in ways that other people don't. And that's really important, and that's really valuable. And it doesn't have to be in terms of the language of DEI. But every time you talk about it, every time you ask questions about it, every time you decide that you're going to organize your research paper or your conversation or whatever through this particular lens, it matters, right? It is a form of resistance. And I think that it's so valuable, to go back to what we were talking about in terms of kind of community care, that it means so much to me to kind of have Lisa organize this and for all of us to be here, because it's one of those few spaces where it feels like we are talking about things that really matter, right? That that AI is not separate from everything else that is going on. It's really just sort of one of the conduits through which that power is happening, and it's a conduit in which Asian Americans are absolutely central.
I'm just going to plug again how great it is to have these talks with people who have 300 years of history memorized and ready to hand, because there is a way in which I think talking about technology acts like nothing has ever happened in the past, that everything is brand new and is unique and sui generis, and then it creates a real problem when people are trying to be analytical, because they don't have most of the context or the data they would need to actually understand. So I want to give you all the last word. If you have any words of wisdom for us, our listeners, about the fear of Chinese tech, which was what we were talking about today.
I think that, I think that I'm going to lean back into this question of, is it fear of Chinese tech or is it fear of tech, right? That we, and not even fear of, but like sort of healthy respect for technology, right? That we should have. I think that fear of China, or specifically the People's Republic of China and its policies, that is a valid thing. I think fear of control over a robust and important technology, albeit one that's moving very fast, right, and whose winners we can't call right now, I think that's a valid thing. But at the end of the day, I would guess that there's more importance that we should place, and maybe more investment that we should place of effort and time and money in and around building guardrails for ethical use of AI in a broader sense, for humanistic ways of integrating this technology into spaces where it won't pillage creativity or replace it, and where there can be a beneficial cycle of these goods going back to the originators of the content in which they feed. And those are things which are rapidly swept under the rug when it feels like we have taken for granted that AI is going to be important as it is right now, and that we have to own it, because if we don't, a foreign power that will necessarily erase us will own it instead, right? As soon as we actually say, no, we have to have it, it is so important that we control it, then we stop saying maybe we have to worry about controlling it, period, as opposed to controlling it instead of someone else.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I actually wanted to pick up a thread that you had said, going back to the idea that Chinese, really Asians in America, always constitute a security risk. And a reminder that we're not safe for that reason, and to think about what that means kind of for our future. I want to just sort of reiterate, or maybe lean into a little what I said, which is that, we could have had a panel, I can imagine Lisa having a panel, where there are Chinese people, China experts, right? Maybe even people from China talking about DeepSeek, right? And talking about Chinese AI. And I think that would have given us a different perspective, particularly a different nationalist perspective. But I really do think that there is nobody that knows more about what it means to be Chinese in America than Chinese Americans. And that is a really unique perspective that is very rarely, very rarely considered. And so I hope that, there will be more spaces for these kinds of voices on these different kinds of topics.
Just to wrap up maybe quickly, and reflecting on Tara's point about the fact that Chinese and, more broadly speaking, Asian Americans are not safe, I think my parting thought is that safety is not going to come from proximity to whiteness. It is not going to come from like doing more and buying into the system in a way that seems more legible to the quote-unquote mainstream. Because at some point, if you're not working against the system will come for you. It'll come for, once it's done getting the other people that it wants to get, it'll eventually come for you, right? So I think that's partly, this is my message as a scholar and teacher of Asian American studies, right, is to sort of think broadly about the different kind of radical and revolutionary possibilities that are out there beyond some of the systems that we've been talking about. And I want to leave that at a relatively high level, because of course we haven't worked out what those specific details are going to be. And we're counting on so many of you, who are especially our students, to help us do that work, to think through what that future will look like.
Thank you for a very inspiring conversation, and thank you all for coming to it.
Yeah, first day lady. I call them